So, we're here.
End of season 1.
End of season 1. Yeah.
I Dream of Jeannie Cusamano, maybe the vaguest title we've had all season.
Big time. I love going to the titles to figure out what the real intention of the show is, but this is a tough one. Very few references to Jeannie Cusamano in the episode.
Yeah, maybe we'll get there by the end.
We will. We maybe have some ideas, but This episode is about a lot of things. Very few of them are related to the dream of Jeannie Cusamano.
But maybe that's a larger symbol of something. I don't know.
Maybe.
We'll
get there. We'll get there. I don't think that's the most relevant part of the puzzle with this episode.
So we have really an episode that picks up almost directly where we left off last week.
Yeah.
In that we have, this kind of fallout of the hit on Tony, or the attempted hit on Tony. But we start off in a really disorienting way as well. So I don't know where you want to start today. I don't know how you want to go.
Let's start at the beginning. I think I have a couple general characters and storylines to kind of follow, but I think actually starting at the beginning is relevant.
Yeah.
Because
we have this very disorienting scene, right? Mm-hmm. So we have this meeting happening in the back of Satriali's, and we don't know right away that it's this kind of fake meeting,
right,
for the purposes of Jimmy
rooting out Jimmy.
But it's fun if you do know that that's the purpose of the meeting, because then you can really see, throughout this episode, really, characters are looking at each other so deep, in so many deep ways throughout this whole episode, but you really see it in this scene. You see Junior looking at everybody, you see Jimmy
Mikey Palmise kind of barely able to suppress his laughter.
Holding it together. Yeah, Tony
being a total pro.
Yeah, but even Tony kind of has this almost sheepish look on his face in some ways too, but
more in control than some of the other characters.
But again, it's this scene where we're kind of what are they meeting about? What is this about? And then we find out it is this kind of fake meeting just to see what information is fed from Jimmy to the feds. Mm-hmm. And then we have a weird cut from that scene, right? We have this kind of fade to black, and then we open on a scene in New York, right? You get kind of a Times Square-ish type imagery with a Burger King.
Burger King, yeah. It's amazing how, as we live in New York, how different Times Square looks now. As a timepiece of the late 90s, it's actually pretty remarkable how much it's changed.
I don't even know if it is supposed to be Times Square.
Well, but even New York in general. It looks so different in the last 20 years.
Yeah. But yeah, and then we have the hit on Jimmy right away. One of the things that stands out to me in the show, maybe we'll get to all the different hits that go on. I know that you were paying attention to that, but one of the things that we see throughout the series, and we've seen it already. Have we already seen it this season? It'll come to me as I talk if it did. But when characters are bringing someone to die, right? So Christopher in that scene,
right,
bringing Jimmy to this hotel, he knows what's up,
right? But
he's able to kind of carry on this very convincing charade. Even as viewers, you're not sure what's you don't know that it's a hit that's coming, right? And Jimmy definitely doesn't know it's a hit that's coming. And Christopher's so good at kind of manipulating that situation. We see it in later seasons, a very
other characters leading other characters to their death.
Yes.
Lest you get carried away.
Yes, I won't get carried away, but
maybe that'll happen.
Perhaps it happens. But yeah, I thought that scene so that's the first of the many hits that we have going on in this episode, which are all kind of the fallout from last week, as well as the fallout from the who's the rat pussy situation too.
Well, I think this entire episode is an episode of fallout. When I think about the arc of this season and the last 2 episodes in particular, there's so much rising action in the second last episode that's leading somewhere. And despite the fact that there's multiple murders and resolutions to conflicts in this episode, for me it kind of does feel like it's just kind of settling. It's just settling the score on all these tensions and issues that have been raised building up to this point. So actually kind of the arc of the season seems to rise and reach its climax in the second last episode, and it seems to just be resolving tensions, if anything, in this episode, which is really interesting. There's something about it that actually kind of feels it's kind of like bringing you home or downwards. Like the line is
Yeah.
kind of falling down from the peak of where it reached in the second last episode.
Which is interesting because in this episode we see scenes that are very like would typically in a mob movie be climactic, right? So like killing Jimmy or the two other hits that take place, right? On Chucky.
Yeah, on Chucky Signore.
And
Signore. My Italian's not very good.
And on Mikey Palmise, of course. So, like, those would typically be, like, moments of high climax or tension, right?
Yes. And I think that this show is very deliberately creating those scenes as almost a caricature of that kind of, like, classic American TV or mob movie. This kind of heightened climax or tension that you kind of get in those scenes of violence. Actually,
but I think you're right. Like, it actually feels more like resolution. It doesn't make you all that tense.
Yeah, I actually think
scenes.
they're deliberate, like they're purposely making fun of it, poking fun at those scenes too. That scene actually where Tony shoots Chucky Signore, and he's on the boat that says Villain 3, and actually the shot where he takes the gun out of the fish, there's a rope blocking 3, so it actually says Villain 2 when he shoots him, and it's the second person that gets shot after Jimmy, and then ultimately we have the third person, Mikey Palmise, who gets shot as the third villain. For me, that's like, it's almost like making a caricature of this kind of like mob hit mentality, this like hits and tits kind of thing, like this like.
No, I think there weren't any tits in this episode.
Well, I guess just the sign of the bada bing.
Yeah, those bees.
Yeah, the bees. But yeah, I think that they're actually poking fun at that genre and the fact that we're looking for that violence and those assassinations for closure or the exciting parts of the show, because that's clearly what the show is not about.
Yeah.
And although this episode engages in that kind of violence and kind of plot devices that are a little bit more exciting, for me they actually don't feel that exciting, and this episode just kind of resolves all these things and kind of like moves downwards and kind of calms everything down.
Yeah, no, I'm on the same page with that.
I think almost everything gets resolved, and they actually, I feel like they're making fun of themselves in those scenes. It's like, oh, you want this violence? Well, here it is, like Villain 1, Villain 2, Villain 3.
Yeah.
And it's like they're just kind of making fun of how cartoonish it actually is. Like what stock writing that is, how predictable those kinds of scenes are.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is, or the interesting thing is, more so with Jimmy and with Mikey that I could think of right now, but actually, like, them killing these characters isn't really resolving all that much. Like, the hit on Jimmy doesn't really resolve the issue with Pussy, right? Which is kind of like how this whole wire and rat thing came up. They're taking it out on him. That scene with him with the rat in his mouth is disgusting, you know? But then the same with Mikey, right? Like, Polly and Chris chase him down. It is this, like, very dramatic scene.
Well, actually, and that was another thing that I had. Like, on that scene where Chris and Polly are shooting him, they actually have, like, the film zooming in on their faces as they shoot.
Yeah, well, and I was saying they don't even mention the beef, like, that this is because Mikey and Junior put a hit on Tony. They both have, like, Polly's pissed because he got poison ivy. Yeah. Which, again, like, continues on. Like, they didn't solve that problem by shooting Mikey. And he's the one who started shooting. And then Chris is still mad about Brendan, right? And so that's his reason for shooting Mikey. Yeah. It actually doesn't, you know... And then, of course, Junior gets, you know, taken by the feds before that can be resolved. So
that's an anticlimax.
There's actually... Yeah, that's a total anticlimax. Maybe we'll come to that scene later. Boo. But, like... No, not boo.
Well, no, I'm just saying the boos that we've referenced in previous episodes from the fight that never happens.
But you have this, like, creepy kind of going up to a door and knocking, right? And then it's the feds. It's not Tony or whatever, right? So it is anticlimactic.
Totally, but,
But yeah, none of the, like, although you feel this kind of, like you're saying, falling action or whatever, it doesn't resolve anything.
No,
really.
And I think that's a key point, because I think that kind of action of murdering somebody to deal with your problems and feeling like you have solved something or resolved anything is so clearly black and white and one-dimensional that it plays into exactly what we've been talking about in the last episodes of seeing the world in black and white terms. Very kind of simplistic, one-dimensional views of how to engage with the world around you, how to respond to conflict, and what the right answer is. And I think that we see characters engaging in that kind of behavior. And it's interesting, actually, how we see, like, black and white themes kind of coming into the shots.
Of course we do.
I'm sure we'll talk about. I don't know. I'm sure you have lots of thoughts about the blacks and the whites and the colors in the show.
Yeah.
But, and grays, lest we forget.
Sure.
I'd like to point out Val is wearing a gray shirt. I'm wearing a brown. Yeah. What does that mean?
Yeah, well, I wore an all-black outfit to go out the other night, and Alex asked me what it meant about my psyche.
What does it mean about your psyche?
It means that I live in New York.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's okay. Maybe we'll see some blacks, whites, and grays and colors in this episode. Perhaps. So, I don't know. We could talk about kind of the different... I mean, again, we have this kind of resolution happening, right? But all the kind of different characters that we have are getting their storylines resolved in some ways individually, in some ways like along with other characters. So do you want to go through maybe like a couple different characters as a way to organize it? Yeah, that would be great. The way I see it, I was kind of focusing on a couple different plots that develop. You have Melfi and Tony, Father Phil with various characters, and you have Artie kind of developing through interactions with Livia and Tony. And the development of those characters and their storylines kind of unfold almost like in acts or something. There's like multiple scenes that unfold the drama, and they all kind of lead to the end. Right. Might be good to start with Melfi and Tony, just because that's actually a rather minor part in terms of screen time in the episode. Yeah, but pretty major in terms of like if we think about the season coming to a close, right? Like where are we at? We opened with Melfi. Exactly. Right? And we have a number of scenes that really harken us back to those initial scenes with Melfi in a lot of ways, and with Tony waiting in the waiting room and stuff like that. So I think it's interesting, tying back into the last episode, it really seems like Melfi is doing something that doesn't happen very often in this show, which is she's kind of hitting us over the head with a psychological explanation for why things are happening. When she pulls out the book, right? She pulls out the DSM-4 and reads from it. I thought that was really over the top. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Well, and in the last episode, she basically gives us a play-by-play on what's going on. Yeah. Which is very unusual because typically there's no closure. Yeah. In fact... Well, she says that. She says, like, usually I allow my patients to come to their own conclusions, but your life is on the line. Yeah. No, totally. So I'm going to put it out there. I mean, this is a show that deals with ambiguities. And actually, that reminds me, something I didn't bring up. The very first scene, the first line we hear in this episode is, okay, so we know what we're going to do. Right. And it turns out that it's actually this fake meeting. Right. So we start off the episode with this like assured comment, and it turns out to be fantasy. Right. Because nobody ever really knows what to do. Right. And characters are dealing with that and often engaging in these kind of black and white decisions because we have a lot of that in this episode. It gives them a sense of closure, even though there is no sense of closure to be had. So with Melfi, it's really interesting that she's basically not only giving a play-by-play, but we actually see that she's correct with determining that Livia was behind the murder. She says she takes no joy in it, though. It seems pretty remarkable that she'd be able to figure that out. It is. And also that she would diagnose her in the with borderline personality disorder. And yet, it's a TV show, so that's okay. Yeah. It's leading us places. Yeah. I thought it was interesting when she said your subconscious was yelling something at you. Yeah. When she's talking about Isabella, referring to the mother, which is something that she ascertained and actually like explicitly states in the last episode. Yeah. Because the show really does tend to propel the narrative forward in moments of the subconscious saying something, in dreams or little elements of characters kind of wrestling with things that are hidden from themselves that maybe they've been hiding. And so that's really interesting. Melfi's really putting her cards on the table. You know, like you said, you know, because it's of grave danger to Tony, she has to. But obviously it's fascinating to see Tony's response to that. Yeah, it's one of the more violent things we've seen from Tony, right? Like it is this very... Up till this point, I would say it's probably the most... Well, I mean, he does beat up some... I mean, there's some... Actually, he's murdered somebody. Yeah, but like, but it's like more, I don't know, like emotionally charged or something like that, and how close it's... Yeah. Like he doesn't kill her, but it's like almost more violent than when he does kill someone. Just being so close to her face, like you can see him spitting on her basically when he's yelling. Well, literally, we can. Yeah. And I mean, we've emotionally been more involved in the relationship between Melfi and Tony than we have between Tony and Chucky Signore.
Yeah.
There's something kind of casual about that scene. There's
Yeah.
some casual violence going on.
And the shirt he was wearing was very casual.
The fish he had was very casual.
But yeah, with Melfi. So what you said was kind of striking a chord with me in terms of Melfi. And I wrote down that line too, where she says, that your subconscious was, I can't even see where I have it written down, your subconscious was shouting something at you, right? So there is something to his dream about Jeannie Cusamano.
Of course.
Right? And I think, so my thoughts, and maybe because this is the one time it comes up, this is where we can hypothesize about it anyways. But I think it does have something to do with that kind of concept of normalcy, or just being like an average Joe, like an average American. Because the Cusamanos kind of are, right? They're like an upper middle class, normal, quote unquote, family. And
in some ways, I feel like they're more than upper middle class. Like they're kind of like the realization of the American dream.
Yeah.
Maybe they're like the stylization of like the ideal American family. I feel maybe more than a typical Joe.
I feel like the American dream is kind of like upper middle class dream, but anyways, that's whatever.
It doesn't matter.
But there's something about that, right? But then it also has this like kind of fantasy associated with it, because he imagines her as having this huge ass, right? And in real life she doesn't. And so it's I don't know.
Right, because we have seen her. It really
very briefly.
Very briefly, but if you've seen the show enough times, like we have, then you start to know these things.
And the fact that he's telling Melfi, like he knows that Melfi knows Jeannie, and he's bringing this up. I don't know. I can't quite figure out what it is. Is it his subconscious yelling something at him or shouting something at him? I don't know.
Yeah.
Our dreams always a relevant hint at what's going on in our lives. Melfi certainly believes that his duck dream is, right? She brings that up on a number of occasions, right? With the castration thing, right?
Yeah.
She's like, that's, one of your fears, and
to be emasculated.
And
really, in some ways he is. We have this kind of Tony is able to kind of win in this power conflict between pretty much everybody except for his mother.
Yeah.
At the end, Livia, when she's being wheeled off, she not only survived, but we have that line where Tony's talking to Carmela. He says, the other guys, I'll deal with them. Myself, I don't know.
Yeah.
And the psychological and emotional turmoil that Livia's able to kind of inflict on Tony, she kind of wins. That's her power, and Tony's unable to defeat that. Yeah. That's the closure that we have at the end of the season.
Well, I do think that Livia is part of the duck metaphor too, because like we do have this we've talked about maybe it being about kind of like losing control on your family kind of, and we have a number of times brought up in this episode.
Or not be able to control everything.
Yeah,
too.
but like we have a number of things brought up in this episode, like Tony talks twice about Meadow and AJ growing up and leaving the house soon, and then he talks about them having families of their own soon. But then we also have, this image of a duck flying away with his penis, right? Yeah. And we have Carmela.
I mean, not literally. They didn't film a duck with a penis.
No, but we know that dream's been brought up a number of times. And we also then have Carmela saying that Livia is a strange duck. Mm-hmm. And I've never heard Carmela called anyone a strange duck before. And I know that the script writers don't do anything that's not on purpose. Yeah. So they are trying to link that with...
Yeah, that was definitely
I think it's family, I think loosely and that level of control. But.
One other thing I thought perhaps with his dream of Jeannie Cusamano is the fact that bringing up this sexual dream within the context of all these murders and assassinations and threats to his life kind of also shows the comfort that he has in that environment. Whereas in the last episode, when he was dealing with the fallout from thinking about who he is and his psychological issues, he was completely depressed and couldn't really engage with anything. But now he's so comfortable that he's like having sex dreams and bringing them up. There's something very casual and kind of nonchalant about it that I think he actually is more in control right now in this world. Like that kind of is who he is.
Yeah.
There's an aspect of that, and I think that that's a theme that gets touched on and re-examined as the show goes on.
Well, Melfi then follows up when he tells her that dream, though, that she talks about his feelings of worthlessness.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if she was like directly referring to that dream and that was her kind of analysis of it. But she said, like, she kind of follows it up. She kind of cuts him off talking about his dream, and she follows up kind of about that with his feelings of worthlessness.
Yeah.
Anyways, I don't know. But yeah, but Melfi. So we have that scene, right? We have the scene where he really violently yells at her because she's talking about Livia, right?
Yeah.
Her reaction, like, she's definitely scared, right? She runs, she closes the door. In the moment, she doesn't seem that scared.
Yeah.
She's pretty stoic in the moment.
Yeah.
And then we see her next when she's leaving her office for the day on another day, and Tony's sitting outside in the waiting room, right? And we see her panic there a lot more than we saw in the actual scene of violence, right? So she's obviously been, like, living with that. And then we see her come to this realization, right? Like, that Tony's like, you're in danger, right?
Yeah.
Which, you know, he doesn't know precisely that she is in danger, right? But he's trying to protect her in some way.
In some ways he does. I mean, it's a fair assumption.
It's a fair assumption, but so anyway, she says she's in danger, and she says, well, I can't testify against anybody.
Yeah.
Right? But then he starts to say, like, he's going to take care of the people who are a threat to her, and then she can come back from her vacation.
Yeah.
Or whatever. And then she has this, like, realization. She's like, oh, people are going to get murdered, aren't they? Right? And that's the one thing that she says to him in the first episode is, the only time I could ever talk to the cops or something, or, like, report anybody, is if they were threatening to hurt themselves or hurt other people.
Yeah.
Right? And then she says to him, he's like, I know what you must be thinking.
Yeah,
and she's like,
you
have no idea.
Yeah, that was a
what
key
I'm
scene,
thinking.
I thought.
And that's the thing that's interesting, I mean, about, like, a therapeutic relationship on one level of those lines. There's, like, on one level, like, Tony doesn't know anything about Melfi, right? Like, that's the nature of that relationship, is she knows very much about Tony.
Yeah.
I mean, some truth, some half-truths, but she knows a lot about it. And so how could he ever say, like, I know what you must be thinking, right?
Right. And yet he needs closure and definiteness in his life. Now, do you think there were some colors in that scene? Do you think there might have been a few colors?
You know what? I didn't see any.
Oh. You wanna...
I was watching it all in black and white. Would you like to talk about the colors?
Oh yeah, no, that would be great, actually. That would be cool. I think there might have been some. I didn't want to bring it up because I feel like I talk about them a lot. But if you're asking, that's cool.
Yeah, I would like to know about the colors.
Well, actually, it's fascinating because there's all sorts of things going on in that scene.
Which scene in particular?
The scene with Tony and Melfi that we were kind of just talking about, where
where she
says,
she has that gray suit on.
Yeah. See, you were paying attention. So she's wearing an all gray suit. We have Tony all in black, and we start to actually see some symbols that have been introduced in previous episodes, like the black phone on the desk is pretty clear.
Yeah.
As well, we also have this kind of white painting in the background in multiple frames of, like, a flower or something that's kind of all white.
Oh yeah.
It's a pretty, like, monochromatic color scheme.
There's, like, a couple panels, yeah.
And and then another really key thing is those gray scissors, actually, which I think is pretty huge. And when she says, you have no idea what I'm thinking, and then Tony says, I know what you're thinking. You can go to the cops, and we know that actually that's something that she could do at this point. She actually gets rid of the scissors. Yeah, and she's kind of, like, disarmed of her only kind of weapon that she has. Yeah. And I think it's really interesting thinking of gray, too, as, like, the combination of black and white. So Tony really always engaging in, it's this or it's this, it's good or it's bad. And Tony and Melfi is kind of like looking at the combination of those two things. It's more complicated. There's kind of like a convergence of these issues. And that's something that we see a lot in this episode. There's a lot of whites and there's a lot of blacks. In particular with Artie's storyline, there's a lot of him wearing whites and then slowly introducing some blacks.
We'll talk about Artie in a second.
No, we'll get there. But what's interesting is there isn't a ton of grays all the time. And I think that signifies something different. And I think that what happens is that Melfi is drawn into Tony's world at this point, at the end. she's disarmed of her power that she has, of anything she could do to kind of have power over Tony or be in control in any way. And she's kind of pulled into this black and white world where it has to be stay or leave, fight or flight, basically. Yeah. And she does end up leaving. And actually, we have that scene where the lights kind of go off.
Yeah, that's
at
such
the
a.
end,
It's
into
that's
blackness.
almost like a dream sequence, like that.
Yeah,
like
it kind of suspends the reality of the scene. But yeah, I thought that was really interesting. Like Tony, she says, "I can go to the cops." Well, actually, she doesn't say that, but she could go to the cops. Yeah. We know that.
Yeah.
Tony says, "I know you're thinking you would go to the cops," and the reality is, like, she can't anymore. She's kind of been. She's just unable to deal with the kind of complexity of these issues.
Yeah.
She's been forced into dealing with things the same way Tony does. And that's the collateral damage of his actions. There's this kind of toxic effect of everything that he does and pulls people into the world that he inhabits.
Yeah.
But I think there was some color, so thanks for asking.
Oh, you're welcome. I'll ask you about it in a moment.
Not that blacks, whites, and grays are really colors, but that's okay.
I would refer to them as shades.
Shades. There's some shades. Thanks for asking about the shades.
Oh, you're welcome. What else? Who do you want to talk about?
We can talk about Artie. We introduced some Artie stuff.
His colors, yeah.
Let's take a break on the colors.
Okay.
Colors. I know you're fascinated and can't wait to talk about them.
Well, we have a lot of scenes that take place at the new Vesuvio. I think maybe that's important also because there is something like at the end of a season, right? That started again in the first episode
in Vesuvios
with Vesuvios getting blown up or whatever. And now in this last episode we actually have their new restaurant is open and there's customers there and Carmela has a fly in her salad or whatever and there's people on ladders, but there's a lot of scenes that take place at this new Vesuvios.
Totally. I also love the kind of sense of foreboding that we get. Charmaine saying she's afraid of it turning into another mob joint. And then the last scene we have is Polly, Sil, Chris, Adriana, all of the Sopranos. They're all there. And
there's some old white lady in the background though.
And an old white lady. But the restaurant is basically completely occupied by that family.
Yeah, and perhaps even gets more so as the series goes on.
Well, they're definitely implying that, or we have a feeling that that's where things are leading.
But
they're out of control.
Yeah. But it's interesting just to kind of lead into Artie, maybe just to talk a little bit about the scenes. Well, no, maybe we'll save them for Father Phil. I was going to say the scene with Carmela and Rosalie.
The stuff with Father Phil and Artie is fascinating because I think that those are two of the distinct narratives in this episode, but they converge.
Yeah.
So you start off with Father Phil and Jackie, and this scene. Sorry, that doesn't make any sense.
No, you start
Father
off
Phil with Rosalie giving him Jackie's watch, the ghost of Jackie, just showing up.
Yeah, well, he shows up to Rosalie and Carmela's lunch.
Yes.
Right? And they're first talking to Artie. So that's how Artie comes into this.
Exactly.
Right? So that's it's our first scene at New Vesuvios.
Yeah.
It's our first scene in this episode where we see Artie. And he comes up to their table. Like I said, we get this sense that things are, there's a few kinks in the new restaurant, like this bug, etc. But there's a couple, again, when I was thinking about the looks that characters give each other, right? Carmela says, we're just so happy for you, with this new restaurant. And something about the insurance money coming through or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so then we see Rosalie kind of give Carmela the side eye. Mm-hmm. And then Artie brings up the carjacking, right? Which was not a carjacking. And again, we see Rosalie kind of giving Carm the side eye.
Yes.
And so it's these characters are trying to protect, lots of characters are trying to protect other characters from what's really true.
Yes.
In this episode, right?
I think truth is a key
series.
part of this.
Yeah.
And this episode, and I think that's when we should talk about characters lying, which actually you kind of started to touch on characters leading people to their death and kind of fabricating the way that they're dealing with their demeanor.
But Artie in this scene is pretty happy, right? He's really he's excited and he's unaware that he's being tricked in any kind of way in this scene, right? And then Father Phil does show up as well later.
Yeah,
but we'll get.
So
to
what's interesting though is that there's this convergence of characters. So actually, we have them converging at the beginning of the episode. Then they kind of go in different directions, deal with the fallout of their various storylines. We have kind of Artie going to Livia. We have Father Phil going elsewhere, and then they actually end up in a place where
back at
their storylines kind of completely converge.
Yeah. at the church we have them converge, and then at New Vesuvius.
Yeah. A couple of things, because I do want to talk about Artie, but it's interesting in that first scene, we have Phil wearing Jackie's watch, which is this kind of element of him being complicit in the behavior of the mob. Like, how can he kind of be this spiritual guide as he's wearing this kind of material possession that's clearly from...
I thought we were going to save this for Father Phil.
Oh, we will. We'll get there.
Oh, okay. But we're also going to talk about it with Artie?
Yeah, we're also going to talk about it with Artie.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Artie is also complicit with the mob.
I'm just trying to complete the scene.
Yeah.
So we have...
I get it.
Yeah,
I get it. Artie is also complicit with the mob.
Okay, cool.
And he says so, right? He's like, you made me a party to conspiracy to commit a crime, right? He's aware. Yeah. He's aware of it.
He's aware of it, and he doesn't tell Charmaine.
Yeah.
Right. See? Thanks.
We got there. Okay.
So anyway... But there's
the watch can be set to have a countdown to the millennium. Yeah,
who knew? It's so handy in 99.
Yeah.
But we do, yeah. These characters are being drawn into the orbit of The Sopranos, both of them. They're these kind of peripheral characters, but they both can't escape the magnetism.
They're both bald.
Wow, deep. What do you think that means?
I don't know.
One thing that I thought was interesting there, too, is actually just thinking about, you mentioned the bug in Carmela's salad. Mm-hmm. There is this weird element of, in talking about power dynamics, Artie kind of being a servant of sorts to the Sopranos. Mm-hmm. Like, even that, the fact that Carmela would bring to his attention that there was a bug there, as opposed to just, like, picking it out or something.
Yeah.
The fact that Artie is constantly this kind of, like, servant character. And we see that, actually, early on
when they do
in the season, when they do the party, and they're kind of, like, they're the help, and you have Charmaine kind of, beckoning.
Yep.
Sorry. Carmela beckoning Charmaine with her hands. I don't know why I'm mixing up every character today.
I don't know.
But that's okay. Then we have that scene with McNulty and Wallace, and
that's a whole other thing.
Oh man, all over the place.
But Artie, okay, so we have that first scene at the restaurant. Is the next time we see Artie when? Oh no, then we see him go to Livia. You're right.
Yeah.
I actually like that scene. That scene I remember.
Of course.
Like from start to end. You know, like. Just how much it shifts. Like you have Artie he's so sweet, and he goes and he brings food, and the way he like sets up her napkin, and he clearly he says like, you used to make the best PB&J in town, right? And he's saying these things. He says slightly different things later to Father Phil about her, right? But to her face, he's talking about these times when they were children, and like she asks how his mother is, and his mother's dead, and she's being classic Livia there. But when she says like, oh, I don't know, like after everything he did to you, and then you see him just shift, it's really...
Well, that's a fascinating scene too, just in terms of Livia's character. So you have these kind of, the windows, there's a lot of light coming in, they're almost like barred, it's like a prison or something that Livia's in at this point. But you have the kind of two-tone lighting on Livia's face that we've seen used for Tony at multiple times, and we've seen the camera spin around to kind of focus on either the dark or light part of his face, kind of signaling the behavior that he's engaging in. And we have Livia, with a very kind of shaded half of her face, almost completely down the middle. And then we have her engaging in behavior where she's being a sociopath.
Yeah.
She's manipulating the situation. She's doing what she does best.
Yeah.
Of... creating conflict, creating tension, being a puppet master and getting people to kind of rail against each other and do what she wants, kind of create chaos.
Yeah.
She's kind of this chaos agent. It's wild.
She totally is. But right, so then we have Artie confronting Tony. I don't know how he knew Tony was going to be pulling in there. That was kind of unclear. They were both in the parking lot.
To set trails.
Okay.
Yeah, Tony goes there all the time.
All right, so he was just waiting.
He's just waiting with his hunting rifle.
Okay.
So that's an amazing scene. And that's one that definitely I remembered very vividly from, every time that I've seen it.
Yeah.
So, there's tons I can talk about with that.
Sure.
I think it was fascinating. Artie has this gun with a scope.
Yeah.
He's clearly so out of his element.
Yeah.
And something that I thought was fascinating, the way that they film it. So, at first, the way that they're filming Tony is a little bit frenetic. It's actually, there's a lot of tension in the frame. It's actually kind of like you're worried, and Tony is worried. We can feel that, but he's worried because he's like, you accepted their money. He thinks that Junior has paid Artie to kill him.
Right.
And as soon as Livia gets mentioned, the shots on Tony are very calm,
yeah,
very still, and actually we actually have kind of like this like low shot that makes him look imposing over Artie now, compared to the angle that's shooting Artie. It's actually like more straight for Artie and more imposing for Tony. And actually the way they create a frame, you can actually see his hands coming up to kind of calm down Artie. He's fully in control of the situation. Now, what's fascinating about that is this scene's a little bit different because we see Tony engaging in a bold-faced lie.
Yeah.
And we see him engaging in a bold-faced lie over something that we've been involved in as the audience throughout the entire season. So we know that he was responsible for burning down the restaurant.
Well, the way he says it, though, I mean, he's so manipulative, right? So he's I never laid a hand on your restaurant. He didn't.
Yeah.
I did not.
I swear to God, I didn't touch your place.
Yeah, touch.
Artie asks again, so you have this like need for closure, for an answer, which I think actually Tony says, "I swear to God, I didn't touch your place," and then Artie says something like, "Tell me you didn't touch my place."
Yeah.
And it's like we had an example of this before. We get ask something, "Tell me you didn't do it. Tell me you didn't do it." It's like people just need closure. On these things. So then he says, "I didn't burn down your restaurant." So it's like clearer, but he didn't burn down the restaurant, but he was responsible for it.
Yeah.
So
and he swore on his mother.
It's an interesting scene because it's kind of like a new level to Tony's character because we've seen him engage in deceit, but this is something where we see him bold-faced manipulating somebody, bold-faced, speaking untruths, and we know everything about this issue.
Yeah.
And we know that he fucked with Artie.
Yeah. Well, and we kind of know in some ways that Artie knows that too. Artie's actually kind of spot on with it. Yeah. He says like, "You did this to help me."
Yeah.
Right? That line sticks with me too. Like he's like, you twisted fuck or whatever. But he got actually really gets it. Like it wasn't just an act of random violence by Tony. He actually was spot on to say like, you did this to help me in your weird twisted way. And I don't know that he ever really believes Tony when Tony,
So
because then he goes to Father Phil, right? So the next time we see Artie,
he does. And actually, another thing about that is the shot that we have on Tony is he's in front of waving branches on trees too, which we've established the kind of that imagery and symbolism. Like there's a sense of judgment on Tony in the background that we're party to. Like we can see that there's something bigger than them. There's this kind of eternal thing outside of them that gets referenced a lot in this episode. And Tony is engaging in behavior that we know now is really messed up, but there is kind of a judgment behind him and above him. Even though he's kind of taken control of the situation. So next we have Artie going to Father Phil, which now we kind of have a convergence.
Why does anyone go to Father Phil? I don't understand.
Great question. Although this is a fascinating scene because Phil is kind of offering moral guidance and he's trying to get him to do the right thing, which he hasn't particularly done in the past. And we have Artie saying to Phil at the end, all due respect, you're getting off the subject. When Phil is telling him that he has to tell Charmaine.
Well, we jump into their conversation kind of halfway through, right? We don't get their full conversation. We kind of sneak up on them sitting in a pew. That's how it's filmed, right? So we don't know how he started the conversation, but I do get the sense he says that he hates life and he hates all men, right? Which is pretty big. It's a big kind of conversation, right? But Father Phil is kind of more focused in on this example of it, but I think for Artie it's a lot deeper than just this one incident.
Totally.
Right?
Do you remember the color of shirt he was wearing?
Artie?
Yeah. Okay. Red. lot going on with Artie in this one with the colors. There's a whole journey that gets documented in colors.
Is that the only time he's wearing a color?
Well, great question, Val. Well, so something that's fascinating, at the very beginning of this episode, we see him in the kitchen in his chef's uniform, all white. All the chefs wearing all white plates, white napkins, crazy white color scheme. Charmaine wearing a super vibrant blue shirt. So see somebody who actually sees things outside of that kind of black and white way. But what's really interesting is this scene where Artie's just kind of consumed with rage. That's him adopting a color. He's trying to make peace with these issues that he's been confronted with. Now, what's really interesting is where it ends up. Because when he has another meeting with Dr. Phil / Father Phil, he's wearing this hilarious black hat, white shirt. There's actually kind of a brown jacket, but it's actually lifted so there's a black kind of lining that's showing. But his transformation from all white to white with some of the black, I think that he's complicit. He's more complicit in the behavior, bad behavior. He's kind of chosen that negative side.
Yeah, to not tell Charmaine. Yeah.
Yeah, and I get it. Like, that's how he deals with his rage and his anger, and that's kind of how he resolves this for himself. But there's not literally blood on his hands, but he's more involved with the dark side than he was before.
Yeah.
Because Father Phil is trying to direct him in the right direction.
Yeah,
he says, you have to tell Charmaine.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating, actually, is that in that last scene where he goes to see him,
Yeah, when they're back at the restaurant.
You have Artie talking to Phil, saying these lines like, just to say it would be, his quote is, I would add to the quotient of sorrow to doubt him.
Yeah.
And it's like, what? What do you... So he starts, like, kind of speaking these platitudes that I'm
Just
actually
like
used to
Father
Phil
Phil,
saying earlier on. And
Well,
it's
and
his rationalization. He's throwing out this nothingness to kind of deal with his problem.
Well, he says, like, you either have to be a yes man or a no man.
He says you can be a positive ion or a negative ion, which I think that's this thing that, I keep on hammering on.
Yeah.
But there's, like, black and white. You can be positive or you can be negative. And that's not what this world is.
Yeah.
That's how these characters engage with it.
Mm-hmm.
There's infinite complexity to all these things. Mm-hmm. All these issues that we're talking about have a purpose, relate to other things. There's this extremely complicated web of information that we're fed. But people need closure and they need right and wrong. And that worldview of you can be a positive ion or a negative ion is what leads Phil to saying, you seem at peace to him.
Yeah.
Which he does. He does seem more at peace, but it's kind of a bullshit worldview.
Yeah, but I think, like, that is something, right? Like, we see this all the time. Like, characters people, right? Like, when people think that they've had it figured out, right, that is peaceful. It's not peaceful to question things, right? When you're living in a sense of disequilibrium or whatever you want to call it, like, that isn't peaceful. It's comfortable to choose a worldview and to sit with it, right? And, like, anything that challenges it, you can completely disregard because you've already decided how you see things, right?
Yeah.
And I think Artie can still see himself as a good person, even though he's made this choice, right? Like, but he's saying he doesn't want to add to the quotient of sorrow. He's saying, well, this information came, like, then he kind of switches his tune on Livia a little bit, right? Like, everyone, from a person who never has a good thing to say about anyone. And, when we were kids, we all knew, you couldn't get on her bad side or whatever it was he said. So he's made it work for himself. Yeah. He feels good about it. And it kind of pays off, right? Charmaine's, like, excited and happy about the restaurant too when she comes up to him later. They're having a glass of wine. But there is this element of deceit that now exists in their relationship. Of course. I'm not saying it's all peachy. But what is in this show? It's just such an uplifting show. Yeah. Well, why don't we go through Father Phil and the things that happen? Okay. Because, they become kind of intertwined with Artie, and we've touched on a few of them. It just makes sense to kind of touch on the others. Because there's also the aspect of... actually, we have kind of touched on a lot of the scenes, because it starts with Rosalie, and... But we have, a couple with Rosalie and with Carm. Yeah, and we have the scene where food is actually directly talked about. And that's something that we've discussed before, and is very apparent in this show as something that means a lot. So we have Rosalie with Phil kind of engaging in the same kind of relationship that Carmela had earlier. Yeah. And we have... Well, you also hear him, just to go back to that scene where they're at the restaurant, you can see Carm's face when he says, like, oh, both of your cooking is, like, I don't know how both of you could come here, something go to Spice Rack. Like, he's basically, like, saying that he has eaten both of their food, basically, right? And so Carm kind of, like, side-eyes Rosalie at that point, because she's like, oh, I didn't really realize that. And when she sees him put his hand on top of her hand, right, she's like, she's jealous. Yeah. And she's also made more aware of some of the things that she already thought about Father Phil, right? Like, she sees him differently. Totally. Knowing that, right? Like, that this is not just something that he's doing with her. This is, like, a part of his personality. Totally. Right? And this leads to her calling him out on it. I think it's fascinating, too, this aspect of food as an element of control. And having Carmela bring the food and Rosalie bring the food when they're in the church. Yeah.
And
there's the music playing in the background. There's like church music, like choir music playing in the background.
Yeah, and Carmela actually, once she sees what's going on, she throws it out. Yeah. But I just love that they all these characters have kind of a hidden agenda of what they want, and they're making food and bringing it to people to kind of get there.
Yeah, well, we see Carmela do that with Livia in the last episode. Like there's always kind of, and we see Tony do it with Livia too, bringing her macaroons and stuff like that.
Yeah, there's some color stuff I won't even talk about. It's fine.
You can talk
purple
about
shirts.
It.
No, it's fine.
Purple shirts.
Just watch the episode and let me know what you think. You can email us.
Yeah.
Stop talking about color.
So. But then we get this great scene. So we have the scene with Father Phil and Artie. We have the scene with Father Phil and Rosalie in the church. And then we get this great scene where he's let himself into the Soprano household, right?
Yeah.
Carmela comes in. He's there in the kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
And she calls him out. Like, she's obviously mad at him because of the Rosalie thing, kind of evidently. But then she gets into, like, you know, she's like, are you staying for dinner? How many steaks should I defrost? And then she's like, because he says something about Tony. I still wish Tony would have come to me, right?
Yeah.
Like, he always uses that as this kind of guise for why he's being so involved in these women's life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so she's like, whatever, like, Father Phil, like, he's a sinner.
Yeah.
Right? But yet you come to this house, you eat steak, you use his media center, right? Like, basically showing how how just like Artie and just like we were talking about someone else are complicit in this mob activity, even though they can still see themselves as holier than thou or good or whatever it might be, right? That like they're by taking Jackie April's watch with the Millennium Countdown.
Yeah. No, and I mean, and that's as close to laying their cards on the table as this show comes with a scene like that.
Yeah.
They're really kind of showing that aspect of the show that's dealing with peripheral characters and people outside of the Soprano orbit not standing up for the right thing and getting involved in it in their own way.
Well, and they make choices to do so.
Yeah, making choices to do so.
I mean, and Carm has it right on here. Like, she really calls him out, kind of like how Artie, you know, can identify exactly what Tony was up to.
Yeah.
Like, she pegs Father Phil for exactly what he is, right? That he manipulates spiritually thirsty women.
Yes.
And it's integrated with food and
tied
the
up
sexual
with food
tension.
And the sexual tension game.
Yeah. Like, she's better than Melfi in some ways. Like, she really, like, she was spot on there. And you could see his reaction to it. Like, he's just kind of like, you don't think he even says anything after that. He just kind of gets his coat and leaves. Takes the movie. Takes one true thing.
Yeah, which also, what an apt title.
Yeah. And she compares him to Tony, right? With that who me shit, right? She's like, Tony gives me this all the time.
Well, and who else? Obviously, Livia.
Yeah, of course. So,
Do you remember do you remember what Carmela was wearing? And maybe what some of the others were wearing?
What was Carmela wearing? Oh. Father Phil's always wearing black.
Well,
I don't know how that fits
he's actually always wearing black and white, except for in this scene where he's wearing a purple sweater.
Oh.
Which is actually a little bit, he's wearing it over. Which is actually a little bit interesting.
But that's kind of a religious-y color. Like in Advent and stuff like that, we have that
Still,
purple.
Typically he's, those shades, right?
We've seen him wear a red jacket before. When he comes, he looks like a pizza man.
But he takes it off right away.
Okay.
He comes out of the storm and it's gone. As soon as he enters the house, it's gone.
Yeah.
His pizza uniform is gone. Well, that's an interesting scene, actually, because you have him wearing this sweater. And I don't know if maybe that relates to... I felt the writing ingratiated myself to Phil more, his interactions with Artie. I actually felt like he was taking in the complexities of these situations. And in that dynamic, Artie was the one kind of saying these nothingness statements and platitudes. And Father Phil actually was kind of being a moral compass for him. Now, what's interesting is Karma's wearing all black, white hair clip. And they focus on it a lot.
The back of her hair with the pearls,
all black. And then, sometimes they'll focus on just... behind her with the white hair clip, and then she'll turn around. So I think she's kind of at this point, she has to make a decision to cope.
On Father Phil.
And she's villainizing him.
Yeah.
I think that, the topic of villains, that we had for the boat and everything, but we have her kind of explaining things correctly, but it's also, it's like kind of cut and dry. you know? And she's analyzing, and maybe there's even something in this to like analysis and coming up with an answer to what's going on, who these characters are, what this show is, what's happening. There's something a little bit or there's something kind of missing the point with that to come up with an answer.
Yeah.
And I think that ambiguity is so important, and I think it's important for us to realize that, as doing this all the time, trying to analyze every little tiny detail, is that this show is deliberately putting things out there that can't be answered.
Yep.
And even in that scene, you know, there's an aspect of her oversimplifying things.
Totally. Well, let's jump to
in
Carm
fact, even
for a
that fact
second.
that that's the one point where sorry, I didn't mean to cut you. But even with Father Phil, you know, kind of engaging in behavior that does ingratiate himself towards us for the first time, in terms of him actually acting as a moral guide for the first time in the entire season, and now he gets kind of villainized.
Well, Artie didn't bring any sexual tension to the table, so it wasn't his game.
I guess not.
Okay, but no, let's jump to Carm for a second, because we were talking about her, and like now she's seeing Father Phil in these black and white ways. We also see her not seeing, well, how should I say? We see her being very accepting for the first time outright of things that Tony is saying he's going to do. So they're in their bedroom that night, or after he, you know, comes to the conclusion that he has to kill Junior and
He's
Mikey.
Being so
he
clear.
doesn't mention Chucky. I don't know why, but
he says, "I'll take care of my uncle. I'll take care of Mikey P." And then Carm starts to console him.
Yeah.
She's so aware. That's the
Yeah.
first time we're kind of led into the level of awareness she has.
Yeah, no, exactly. And she's, like she's just kind of holding him, and she brings up these things around Livia, right? Like she's obviously like, she can see these connections for Tony there as well. But yeah, like she knows exactly what's going on, and that made me think back to the scene with her and Rosalie and Artie, right?
Yeah.
That like we have to assume, even if we don't see it explicitly told to Carmela.
Yeah.
I think this scene really tells us that we have to assume that she is complicit. I mean, by association, but that she knows everything, right? So we see, like when they talk about in that scene at New Vesuvio, when the fire is mentioned, Rosalie kind of like looks sideways at Carmela, right? Like really indicating like Carmela knows that it was Tony.
Yeah.
Right? And we've never seen Tony tell Carmela, like, that's what we did to Artie's restaurant or whatever. But we know she knows. Same with the quote-unquote carjacking, right? She knows. And now we know, like, she knows that he's going to go out and kill a bunch of people, just like then Melfi kind of comes to this realization. And Melfi kind of does a similar thing. Melfi does not report it.
Yeah.
Right? So we see these, again and again, these characters choosing to not do the right thing when it comes to the world of the mob.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. Or just basic morality. People are not principled.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, they do what's easy.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing that was actually interesting in that scene with the way that they start, they focus on the house in nature, kind of, which we've
Twice
talked about.
they do that, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they really established the theme of the kind of trees and the wind, which is interesting because we'll get to that in the last scene, the way that that kind of ends the season.
Well, we had wind last episode too.
Oh, it's been all over the place. Yeah. I mean, everywhere. Also, so when they have the house in nature, and then they go into that scene that we were just referencing. Tony is actually in front of a painting that has characters in it, but the way they construct the frame, Tony's blocking the only figure, so it's actually just a landscape behind him. And we have, and then the camera kind of shifts, but we have like the nature outside the house, the nature behind him. There's constantly just this sense of judgment around or behind him from everywhere we look. In all these scenes, actually, Carmela in the kitchen, kind of looking out the window. This thing that we've been talking about the whole time, the greenery, kind of just shows up everywhere in these pivotal scenes. Landscapes, nature, trees, wind, greenery. There's something that's larger than everybody that's kind of looming over all of this drama and development.
Yeah, so we could talk about maybe that last scene, and then I just have some kind of
I have a few
random
I actually have a few
thoughts,
things outside of that. Yeah, before we get to the last scene.
okay.
Well, actually, I'll kind of keep with what I was saying. The nature stuff. I mean, Mikey's scene where he's killed, villain 3.
Yeah.
We actually have him running off the street into the wilderness.
Well, sorry. Could we start with the scene that's in his home? Because that's such a great scene, and then we'll get there. I promise.
Yep.
But like, we only meet Mikey's wife. I forget her name.
If we even hear it.
I think we hear it last episode, but whatever. We hear him call her a hoe, right? And then tells her to go take a Midol.
Yeah.
But then her story, and I know I saw you jotting this down too.
Yeah.
So those are the last words that he says to her, and then he goes running off into the wilderness, right?
Yeah.
Which we'll get to. But then we see the scene where on the news they're reporting that like everyone got arrested, and also Mikey Palmise was killed, and she says, the last thing he said to me was that he told me he loved me and that he'd be right back, right? So, I mean, Mikey's a piece of shit. Everybody knows that.
Yeah.
I'm pretty black and white on Mikey. I've never seen any redeeming qualities of his. But she does,
Morbid
right?
flag.
Like, but she's at least wanting, there's something she likes about him.
Yeah.
And she's kind of selling him that way. Right? In the media piece for whatever reason.
Yeah,
Anyways.
no, I thought that was fascinating, actually, because for me, that introduced, when I saw that.
And Carmela's watching it. Sorry, Carmela's watching it, and you can see Carmela is thinking.
Mm-hmm. That introduced something that I think I talked about a little bit earlier in this episode, just the topic of lies and dishonesty, and it comes up so much here. You have that very direct one about Mikey. That's something that, again, we've been privy to all this information. We know it's not true. We've been privy to all the information of what led to Tony and Artie's conflict, and we know that's not true. We have Chris to Jimmy. We know what's about to happen. He's faking it. We have Carmela talking about she can't do it with Junior and Livia. She can't put on this face, but she does. So we have all these characters engaging in dishonesty. And I think that's like the bread and butter of how all these characters live their life.
Well, and how they kind of have to function in some ways.
Yeah. Totally. So getting back to nature. I mean, pretty simple, but we have Mikey running off the street. He kind of like disappears off the frame into the greenery. Then we have those amazing shots of him running down the street surrounded by the woods, the car coming, and then he actually bolts into the woods. What's great about that is the music, not music, but all we hear is just nature sounds.
Yeah, really loudly. Really
loudly. There's no music, there's nothing. So it's not like exciting in the way a scene like that typically would be in a TV show or a movie. All we have is just the soundtrack of nature.
Yeah.
And we have like crickets chirping and bird sounds. And it's fascinating because now they're just surrounded by nature, which they've established so strongly to relate to death and the afterlife. And actually, right before he dies, he falls into the water, and there's actually a big splash.
Right.
Which reminded me of a David Hockney painting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that they referenced.
The Big Splash.
The Big Splash, yeah. So earlier on. So, which, that was maybe referring to Jackie, who then shortly thereafter died. Obviously, we've been talking about bridges relating to death.
We see Vin
Makazian jumping into the water. So these aspects of nature, whenever we've had character Vin Makazian looking out at the lake at the end of the driveway, whenever we have them either within nature or around water, those are definitely things that are related to not good things.
Yeah.
To things that are not bueno.
It's Chris and Polly's first adventure out into nature together.
Yeah, and Polly does not do great with it. He's very uncomfortable with poison ivy.
Yeah. So then to go along with the nature thing, so like our closing scene for this season starts with Tony. Well, there's the power outage at Melfi's office, right?
Yes.
So lightning strikes. We hear thunder. The power goes out. We then see him driving over a bridge, right? And we've had a lot of bridge imagery. It's raining quite heavily. We see a reflection of him in his rearview mirror like we do in the opening credits. So it's a nice kind of like closing.
Yes.
And I mean, they didn't know if Sopranos was going to get picked up for another season. Maybe they did. No, probably not at this point. I don't think they knew it was going to get picked up for the season. So they were really trying to tie up a lot of ends.
There's something final about it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's closure to pretty much every aspect of tension that's been introduced in the show.
Totally.
It's actually pretty remarkable.
But we have this nice rearview mirror shot of his face, right?
Yeah.
And he's, perplexed. And then we see him and the whole family in the car together. They're going to Aunt Patty's, who we only again see like once in the whole show, but they're heading there, and they get stopped because of these fallen trees.
Yeah.
Right? So things are falling apart. Things are like that, you know, all these things that we don't have control over, those are caving in on us basically, right? Like it's making it impossible for us to go on with our lives normally.
Yeah.
And then they show up at New Vesuvius.
And yet it does lead them to this scene where Tony has the toast, and we have an extreme close-up on his face, which we also know we've seen is kind of related to these key moments. And he says, you know, if you're lucky, you'll remember little moments like this that were good. And there is something about, again, relating to food, maybe in a different way, these family moments where they're all together and they're actually taking a second to maybe think about some of these things as a family, to think about something positive, to embrace the fact that they're a family in the same place over a beautiful meal that, maybe, you know, embraces their cultural identity and heritage. It's about as positive of note you'll ever find in this show.
Right.
And it gets referenced later on.
Right.
And there is something that's so kind of nihilistic and bleak about this show, but I always kind of come back to that moment as there is something that exists in this world that is a little bit good. Now, right after he says that, we have a big tree crashing. So there is this inevitability that bad things are coming. And actually...
But that there are good moments. And I think that's kind of what he says, right?
Well, what's fascinating is he talks about, if you're lucky, you'll remember little moments. And the fact that the tree falls right after, I was like, wow, that was literally a moment.
Yeah, so short.
I mean, that was about it. And that's about all the show will give you. I mean, it's nothing. But that's what we get. And it's interesting that they do leave the season on somewhat of a positive note.
But I mean, then you see the restaurant full of mobsters, and you know, like it kind of zooms out on them, and everyone's looking at each other like they love each other, right? Like we see like Carmela and Tony kind of like snoggling, and we see Chris and Adriana and we see Polly and Syl having a moment of romance.
And there's an inevitability of death.
Yeah.
And we've established, I mean, we've talked so much about the greenery and the trees and them wrestling in the wind. Well, the wind just picked up and it will fall.
Yeah.
So inevitably, something will come crashing.
Yeah.
And we'll see that unfold.
Lots of things come crashing.
But they can have these beautiful moments, but there is this inevitability of they're not in control of everything, and there's something larger than them, and it will catch up to them. Even though it seems like Tony escaped everything and got away and wrapped up all the loose ends, almost to a comical point, how much everything kind of turned out for him, even though things are falling apart for people around him. Melfi, and God knows what's happening to her patients, just as one example.
Right. And she mentions that, right?
Yeah.
Like she has patients who are suicidal.
But who cares? You know, we have Tony as the central figure. I mean, you obviously should care, but that's kind of the mentality of the show.
Yeah.
And Tony, it's really about him, and he really is at the center of the show. But we know that there's something bigger, and even if everything is perfectly wrapped up in a bow in a way only a TV season could be, things will come.
Well, but
to roost.
most TV doesn't end like that. Like most seasons of TV leave you on a cliffhanger. That's how the typical serial kind of works. Like seriously, yeah. Like not good, not always. No,
but in
I
general,
shouldn't say good
in
TV.
film, what about film though? In terms of
film comes to a close. Film.
Yes.
You know,
unless
it's
and what about a series ending? When something finishes,
a series ending typically comes to a good close, and this series is the anomaly from that.
Yeah.
So I mean, we've talked about this. Chase is always playing with what our expectations of TV are, right?
Totally. And it's fascinating that there is such a sense of closure at the end of the first season. Now they, like you said, they didn't know if it was going on, but they're definitely playing with these elements, and even the fact that everything's closed, but the last thing we hear is that tree falling after there's been such a strong establishment of what the tree is.
Yeah.
There really is actually no closure. It's not as strong as where the show actually ended up.
Yeah.
But they developed their language and they developed their sense of dealing with these issues.
Yeah, totally. I just have a couple stray thoughts.
Yeah, there's a few
pretty
things
long,
to talk about.
The one thing, I can't figure out why it's important, but I think it, again, like I never question that these writers know exactly each word they're picking precisely. But sisters are mentioned 4 times in the episode. And I know there's definitely obviously themes about womanhood and like the relationships between female characters and the way that female characters interact in this world. But Carmela brings up Tony's sisters and how they got out of there as soon as they could when they were young or whatever. Like there was a hit out on them, she says, but like they really ran from this. And then of course they're going to his sister Patricia's later on in the episode. When Livia comes, which I forgot about that Livia like wanders to the Soprano house somehow from her retirement home. And she keeps referring to Meadow as by her own sister's name, right? And they're talking about that.
Right.
Charmaine says, Carmela is like a sister to me. When Artie's like, your best friend's out there, like, why won't you go say hi? And she's like, Carmela's like a sister to me, but I don't want this place to be a mob place. And then when we were there in the last scene, Charmaine also says like Kiara and her brother and sister in the back, right? Like, which I don't know why they would call one of them by name and then the brother and sister. I don't know. But again, like, I don't know what they were kind of indicating with that, but I did find it interesting. And I think our female characters do deal with this world in a different way than the male characters do.
Totally.
And so,
definitely.
And we see, Meadow at the family dinner even that they have with Livia and Junior, right? Like our female characters interact in different ways.
Totally.
So, anyways.
Totally, yeah. I think we have to talk about the last scene just before the last scene of Livia and Tony.
Yeah.
Tony picking up the pillow.
Yeah.
Even if just briefly addressing the smile that Livia has on her face and actually just interpreting that.
It's so ambiguous.
It's so ambiguous.
I
and
know.
That's something, maybe my reading of it has changed over time. And I think I talked about this in previous ones, but it was hard for me to imagine that Livia was as engaged in the behavior as I maybe believe now.
Yeah.
And watching it this time, it really did seem like a smile, but it's almost like a Rorschach test.
Yeah, totally.
Going back to what they're talking about at the beginning of the season. I mean, it's ambiguous. There's really no way to tell.
And even on the FBI tapes that they bring Tony in to listen to, right? Like, though even those tapes are still ambiguous, right? We hear the conversation that we've heard before between her and Junior, and she never outright says it. Although we see that Tony believes that that's what she's saying, right? We see his face completely shift in that scene, right? Like when her voice comes on the mic or on the tape player or whatever it is. You see his face like completely fall, and we have such a close up of his face there. It's like we can see his pores. We're like so close, and we just see his realization of that moment.
Totally.
And then we see that play out not until the end of the episode, the scene that we're talking about when he goes to ostensibly smother her. I don't know.
There is a sense, and I talked about this earlier, of her smiling. Like there's a sense of me as she gets carted off, ending the season with her winning. So Tony kind of wins everything. He wraps up everything with a bow, but that isn't. And when he talks about, I'll deal with them to Carmela, but inside I'm not sure.
Yeah.
That really is the resolution of the season.
Yeah.
He's able to deal with the violence and the mob associates and that side of the family and all the issues that have arisen because of that. But with Livia, she manipulates him psychologically in a way that isn't so clear cut.
Yeah.
And as she leaves, it's hard to imagine how Tony will deal with that going forward.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Maybe that's the one thing that's kind of left on a cliffhanger.
Yeah. Yeah. And what color was the pillow that Tony was going to smother her with?
White.
Rainbow.
Rainbow?
No, it was white. You're right, it was white. Oh. But that's enough. That's enough on whites, blacks, grays.
Yeah. Do you have anything else?
That's it. I'll leave it on a rainbow joke.
Cool.
An excellent rainbow joke.
Well, if any of you listened to this whole first season, that's great.
Congratulations. Thank you.
Congratulations to us for talking about 13 episodes.
Yeah.
only a few times could you not see my eyes rolling, which is great about podcasts.
Yeah.
And yeah, we'll start up with season 2
Really shortly.
Yeah.
So looking forward to it. Thanks for listening.
Yeah.
And we'll be back soon with more Sopranos.
Bye.